What's good,
What's good?
everybody? My name is Torraine Walker. Welcome to Torraine Walker TV. I want to give a shout out to some new Patreons that we had come in a couple weeks ago. Shout out to Michael, Eric, and shout out to Jessica. Thanks so much for being a Torraine Walker Patreon and supporting the channel. And if you want to support the channel, you can check me out at Cash App Torraine Walker, PayPal Real Torraine Walker, Patreon Torraine Walker, Venmo Torraine Walker, and Zelle Torraine at torrainewalker.com. Thanks a lot for everybody for hooking me up and taking care of the studio. I told you I had to build a new studio out, and some of you have seen it over the past couple of weeks. This is what it looked like when I moved into the new space, and this is what the backdrop looks like now, which is right behind me. So I want to get right into the show. So thanks again, thanks everybody for showing me love. Street hustlers, street legends, street tales. The public has always been fascinated by gangsters and has always lived vicariously through gangster stories. These stories have always been big business for entertainment from the days of James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart up until the modern day stories of power, Snowfall, and American Gangster. And while some of these stories can be considered exploitive, other filmmakers explore that world through and that history through a more observationist lens. And I have one of those filmmakers with me today. Brian Boss Valmond is the creator, narrator, and producer of the series Rich in the Hood, premiering this month on YouTube. And I got him sitting with me right now. Brian, how's it going, brother?
I'm doing good, man. How you doing?
Good, man. Good to have you here. Glad you could take time out of the day to chop it up with me.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about the series, man. What inspired you to create this?
Man, when I was in high school, my last year of high school, one of my former English teachers, she had kind of lit the fire up in me to continue with my creative talents, and she was telling me that I should combine my love for film and my talent to write and create a career out of it. So she had planted the seeds for me, and ever since then, I've been so keen on just telling stories, specifically our stories, which led to me creating my platform on Twitter and Instagram and just taking our stories and telling them in my way. I figured that if I built a platform for myself, showcasing my talents and telling the stories that people may have known and others that don't know at all, that it would be a good thing for me down the line. And I went into it blindly. It was something that I put a lot of my faith in God and just tried to find my way. And I just put in the work, and then everything started to fall in place. So now is the right time for me to pursue those film aspirations more seriously because I was able to build that platform over the last 6 years. And that's what spawned the idea for me to do Rich in the Hood. It just felt like it was the right time to do it.
Yeah, because I first became aware of you on Twitter because you were posting like a lot of this history of like street life and hustler life in New York and other cities on Twitter, and it blew up. So what inspired you to start doing that? Because that was a unique way to go about telling the story.
Yeah. So going back to high school, I started writing screenplays. I taught myself how to write them, and I wanted to sharpen my pen after I realized that being a filmmaker was what I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And I realized that having your own platform and creating your own world and having a large amount of followers that support you, it could help me along that journey. I didn't go to film school, and there wasn't the means for me to step into that world the way that I wanted to. So I just created that lane, and just with my fascination for history. Period. I always been like a history nerd in that kind of way, just loving history and always going back in time, and just being a research junkie. It just led to me wanting to tell our stories, man, and specifically black. Like I wanted my content to just be black, and I wanted to create my lane in that way. So that's what led to me starting to do the threads on Twitter. And once I seen that one blew up, which was an accident, then I just kept on doing it and just stayed consistent for the last 6 years.
Which one was the one that blew up?
I had did it on Ronald Reagan and Freeway Rick. I kind of just talked about the CIA's involvement to bringing cocaine into the U.S. The initial tweet wasn't even a tweet that I started. It was about Ronald Reagan and the Dreamers. And me being a kid of two West Indian parents, I understood the immigration process and what they went through. But I kind of felt like the media was applauding him for one thing and ignoring the other. So being as though by then I was already knee deep in my research of the crack epidemic because of the stories that I was writing and the stories that I was researching, it just led to me to respond to that tweet with a quote. And then that quote tweet blew up. And then I just started putting other thoughts and telling a story. And then it became a thread. This was before the thread feature was even a thing. This was like just finishing off the summer in 2017. So You couldn't even do a thread like how you do now. You had to make an individual tweet under the tweet, and it was like me responding to myself 100 times.
Okay. What's unique about the series is that you provide context around the street hustles you document. You go into the detail about the neighborhoods they grew up in, the economic conditions they grew up in. Was that a deliberate creative choice, or did you just kind of fall into that narrative framework?
I would like to say it was both. Um, for me, it's easy for my content to be, passed off as me glorifying it, and that's been a thing. Like people that don't seem to understand what I'm trying to do look at these stories and these street stories from an entertainment standpoint because we have these shows now that showcase our history in that kind of way. But I made it deliberate to give more context on the time period, the conditions that these men grew up in, and what led to them to be who they became, before incarceration, or unfortunately a lot of them died. But majority of these men, after being through the system, was able to look back on their circumstance and they became better human beings as a result. And perspective is everything, because when you're in that environment, you try to survive, and you're just trying to make ends meet, and you're trying to figure out how to be ahead of the curve and not continue that chain of poverty, which is why drugs seemed so intriguing back then. It was just the Reagan era was about getting the dollar, and whoever could get it, and that was the way for us to get it back then.
Yeah, that's something I guess I noticed on the series as well. You don't take any sides one way or the other with the material or your subjects. You present these stories like a journalist, and just state the facts and talk about the details of the street hustlers world. How did you come to the idea to shoot that way? And was that sort of a deliberate choice to do it like an almost documentary style, sort of like a embedded journalist?
I would say it was more instinctual, because the way that I've always told my stories was from that perspective. Like there's not a bias. It's always been, this is who I'm talking about, this is where they're from, this is what they've done, this is where they ended up. And I think just through the last couple of years of me staying consistent in that style of telling a story, it just it meshed perfectly with me wanting to do this thing documentary style. I love documentaries, so just for me watching and learning throughout the years and having my favorite documentaries and my favorite narrators, it was easy for me to put the story together in that way because of how I was telling my stories on the internet.
Okay. Have you gotten any feedback from, you mentioned earlier about some people feel like these stories can be exploited at some time. Have you gotten any feedback? People are saying that that's what you're doing instead of just telling the story.
Nah, not for this documentary, man. I feel like now this documentary finally, even with me just promoting it, people are starting to see. And even with the trailer I put out, like there was no street gangsters in that trailer. I'm putting politicians. Joe Biden has started off the trailer. I put Ronald Reagan in there, Nancy Reagan. I put George Bush, HW Bush. Like I'm talking about the systemic aspect of it too. It's not just so and so made X amount of dollars and they're from this hood and this is what car they had and this is what they wore. Like I'm talking about everything across the board, why they were even able to get those type of things selling drugs, and where did those drugs come from. So I feel like within the last month and a half, my long-term followers already understood where I was going with this, but those that recently found my page and are just starting to understand my content, they're seeing, okay, this is not just for entertainment, but this is also an educational thing as well. And that's the main thing that I wanted people to see. Like we're not glorifying this thing at all. We're trying to just tell stories and keep the history going because it's important. It's history. We can't ignore it.
Hmm. Um, Something that stood out to me was the business genius of a lot of these gangsters. It reminded me of some of the things Malcolm X said about West Indian Arch and some of the people he used to hang around, the numbers runners, the bookers and stuff like that. A lot of he's in his autobiography said a lot of the people he knew would have been academic and corporate titans had they lived another life or had other options. Did you get that feeling when you were doing your research?
Absolutely. These men were smart, because you also hear stories of rap artists and people that are in the industry that tried to sell drugs back then that couldn't sell their drugs or didn't understand the money aspect of it or didn't know how to properly maneuver. It wasn't an easy thing to just go out there on the block. And I know with a lot of other documentaries and the way some other people told their stories, they made it seem that way, but there had to be a strategy. You had to know who to trust and who to have around and to always be watching over your shoulder for law enforcement and the enemies and so on and so forth. That was a strategy. And as Malcolm X said, had these men lived different lives and applied this in a different setting, it could have been very successful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You do have a lot of OGs speaking from those days on some of the segments. How are you able to get those interviews, first of all? Because these aren't people who normally talk to the press or anybody else about their life.
Just going through archive research. It's a lot of dope people out there that are doing these interviews, and some of them get buried in the archives. So I try to be sure to definitely credit those that I got my audios from, because I'm not monetizing off of this. I'm just using this documentary as a foundation for my future work. So anybody that I've gotten stuff from, they'll be credited in this documentary. And stuff just gets lost on the internet. I feel like now there's a purge on the internet with information where things are being purposely taken off. You even see now books are being banned. Certain books aren't being allowed in certain areas. So this is just years and years of collecting archive and storing them in my phone, and like buying storage to keep stuff. Like I have over 20,000 photos and over 10,000 videos going back from 2017 when I started collecting stuff, because a lot of that stuff, even if I have the time and I type it in, you can't
Mhm.
find it no more. These things are, the internet is, kind of purging itself in that way, cleaning itself out. And especially with Black history, is getting rid of Black history.
Why do you think that is?
They don't want to repeat the times. I feel like, history always repeats itself. I don't even think that's a feeling, that's a fact. History repeats itself, and I feel the powers that be don't want Black children to get inspired or to learn from certain situations. And the 80s was such a pivotal time in history. Hip hop being the number one music genre in the world right now, and the influence of hip hop all came from that era. And I just feel like, the kids now are so easily impressionable. They just try to find a way to not let them be aware of where they come from, because it could either be a repeat of that or they could learn from it and do better. So they just get rid of it as a whole. That's just my opinion.
Well, no, you have a point there, because if you look at the rise of hip hop, a lot of labels and a lot of artists who came out of the hip hop era, especially like the mid '80s up until the early '90s, they came out of that hustler mindset.
Yep.
They might not have been in the streets, but they may be familiar with the streets. Some of them were in the streets, and they were able to apply some of that mentality into the music business and creating their own labels and selling their own music.
Yep.
And I think there's a lesson there, and I think there's some education that could be shared with among younger people now or newer people now that they don't want people to get.
Yeah, absolutely. And that information is being taken away because they don't teach about the 80s or the 90s in school, but all of that is a part of history. And I always told my followers too, like in school, we always learned about Black history up until the 60s. And even the history they taught us in school wasn't even the real thing. It's really, really watered down. But you still have the 70s with the Black Panther parties, but then also the destruction of the Black community in the 80s, the late 70s, the early 90s, and so on. Like, that's important. Kids need to know that, especially Black children. You can't just keep the history one dimensional, MLK, and that's it. Because even when they talk about civil rights, they're not covering everything. They don't talk about Malcolm X. They don't talk about Medgar Evers. They don't talk about the Black Panther Party. So I just try to bring a different side of history though, and I try to cover a little bit of everything. Like if you go on my page, I've covered the Black Panther Party. I've done threads on Malcolm X. I've done threads on Martin Luther King and so on, and Fred Hampton. So my content is not just about street hustlers and hip hop and the 80s, but I talk about the revolutionary side of things as well.
Hmm. Um, there's a lot of archival footage in your series from the '80s and '90s. Did you pull that from archival footage, or were you talking to people who were around that time who had some of that stuff, or how'd you pull that? Because it looks really fascinating when you're talking about these people who lived in that world, and you show the footage of where they lived at and the times that they lived in.
So some of the pictures and stuff comes from the people themselves. I was able to connect with some of the OGs back then. I guess you could say that now. 2017 was a long time ago, but back then I was able to connect with some of the hustlers, and they would send me pictures, and I would store them. And then a lot of the archive videos, archive footage, sorry, of the times and where they lived at was just through my own archive research, and my editors. They've done a really beautiful job in finding things, and my researchers that I have on deck as well, just doing a good job capturing the time. So to keep the story cohesive.
Okay. The real life drama in your series is even more dramatic than the Hollywood content, influenced by some of these stories and some of these people. Several of your subjects even say that the risk of that time was part of the draw along with the money. What about that?
I mean, I feel now, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because a lot of what happened in the streets was way more raw and way more dangerous than what's being shown in Hollywood, because Hollywood kind of glamorizes it, and they show the buildup of anti-establishment organizations and people that go against the government in their ways and how they do things. But they're not really showing how destructive it was because they know it'll turn people off. If the right people's watching this stuff and they see what really happened, it'll turn them off. People getting family members killed, kidnapped, and all these other things that I will talk about in this documentary. It turns people off if you have common sense. At a certain point, the entertainment stops, and it's like this was crazy. There's no reason why this even should have been happening, but it did. So that's why for me, I try to keep my content very balanced between like the entertainment aspect because I know people like to see and hear what that time was and who did what, but the destructive aspect is where the education comes in because a lot of this we didn't bounce back from as a community across the nation.
That's actually a really good point. Um, as violent as that lifestyle was, there seemed to be a sort of unwritten rule that people uninvolved in that world who were civilians were pretty much kept out of it. The introduction of crack changed that game for the worse. Anybody who happened to live in the neighborhoods where the underworld was active could become potential victims, either through violence or through victims of circumstance. There was more money coming into the street life and the hustling, but there was more damage to the community as well. Do you explore any of that as the series goes on?
Absolutely, absolutely. Civilians, unfortunately, they definitely caught the heat. If civilians had family members that were in the streets that were big shot callers, and if they had issues with somebody and they couldn't get that individual, then they were next. And the streets in the 80s and the 90s became lawless because there was no structure. You had in the 60s and the 70s, you had young guys answering to the big bosses, and you had to work your way up the hierarchy, and things had some form of organizing it. But in the 80s, it was wild wild west. Every man for himself, and people suffered as a result of that. And you have young guys 15 16 years old making millions of dollars. You can't tell a 15-year-old much as making that amount of money because he or she is not thinking that that's going to stop because the money just keeps coming in, and you come from being poor to being able to get everything you want. And if somebody threatens that, then you automatically go into a certain mindset, and it was just a domino effect with that. So
Um, do you think we're still feeling the effects of that time?
absolutely, our inner cities are still terrible with that. You still have kids murdering each other, and from my own personal experiences, I've had friends as young as 15 years old getting killed in their neighborhoods, and I've seen that as a youngster in high school, and even as I was starting to come of age. A lot of guys that I grew up with, a lot of guys I spent time with, they end up dying before the age of 25 as a result of gun violence in the community. Just trigger happy, the easy access to weapons and the street life. It's all you know as a result of what happened back then. History repeats itself, and some things stay permanently damaged. And I feel like our communities are permanently damaged as a result of the crack epidemic.
All right. What do you want people to take away from the series as a whole?
I just want people to learn something, man. I want people to really see that where we're at now didn't happen overnight. The music we love, the style that we love, our mindset, the way we are, the way we talk, it didn't just happen overnight. Like this was a result of the times that happened before us. The 80s was such a pivotal time. It changed the world. It changed everything that we know now. And we didn't do this to us. I want people to see that too. Like drugs didn't come in the community because of us. These drugs were brought to us. And this is what the government helped create with their involvement, as much as they denied it, but it's been proven it, we didn't do this to us. And I see on the internet a lot of people, they talk down on the black community now, and they talk down on the kids now in this generation, but this generation didn't make themselves. And it is, I just want people to learn like this didn't happen to us overnight. And I just want to bring a certain type of perspective as opposed to my counterparts that are telling these type of stories. I really want it to be well balanced, non-biased, just giving you the facts and allowing you to make your own opinion and start your own conversations.
All right. Rich in the Hood debuts May 28th exclusively on YouTube under Valtown Entertainment. Brian Bross Valmond, thank you so much for giving me your time, brother.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.
No, no doubt.
Yes,
All
sir.
right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Thanks for checking in, and be sure to check out Rich in the Hood when it debuts upcoming in the next couple of weeks. My name is Torraine Walker. This has been Torraine Walker TV. Y'all be good.